Hello again everybody, and we now turn our attention to some famous buildings. There's going to be quite a few of these and I'm going to leave the world of Rome and go to the world of Greece. Now the 5th century BC was a climactic time for Greece and especially for Athens. There was a more or less constant threat or a feeling of threat of the Persians invading, and indeed they did invade twice, in 490 and again in 480 to 79. And there were some major political developments, especially in Athens, with the advent of and quite serious development of democracy, with world-altering consequences which we still feel today. There were a lot of artistic changes happening too. There was a development of drama and theatre, which we've explored a little already. And there were major architectural and artistic developments too. So I'm going to think a little bit about artistic developments today, and in particular one building, perhaps the most famous Greek building of all, which stood on the Acropolis of Athens. The Acropolis, and many Greek cities had an Acropolis. It means the high city, so it's a high point of a city, often dedicated to the gods. It's sometimes translated as a citadel. Now the buildings on the Acropolis in Athens had been demolished and ransacked by the Persians in 480, in the 480 invasion, and so it was an embarrassment to the Athenians, and it was a sad state of affairs that their most sacred place had been wrecked by an invading force. There are several famous buildings to talk about on the Acropolis. The most famous, the Parthenon, of course, but there are others, and they're going to be the subject of some different talks. But first of all, the Parthenon. What was it for, and what was it like, and why is it so famous, and what political developments are there to do with it now? Well, it stands on the rocky outcrop of the Acropolis in the centre of the city, which was a semi-fortified citadel, similar to some other cities. It was the Parthenon was the purpose of it was to replace an older building to Athene Parthenos, which had started to be built but hadn't been completed, and that had been more or less levelled by the Persians. Some of that was then reused in building the new Parthenon. Some bits of it were reused elsewhere on the Acropolis. Now, by the time the Parthenon came to be constructed, probably started in 447 BC, Athens was the dominant power in the Aegean. It was the head of an empire which was called the Delian League. This had been founded as an anti-Persian defensive alliance, but by the time of the 440s, this idea of an anti-Persian alliance had seemed to be less important because there had been less trouble from the Persians, and indeed a rapprochement of the Peace of Callias in 450-449 BC. So the money that was being collected every year from the allies in the Delian League was going to be used for something, and Pericles, the great Athenian statesman, decided that it was time to rebuild the buildings on the Acropolis. And in some ways this is a legitimate use of the money, because it was to rebuild temples which had been destroyed by the Persians. In other ways it was a completely illegitimate use of the funds, because it benefited Athens and Athens alone, and not the other states within the Delian League. Anyway, under the design of the architects Iktinos and Callicrates, it was going to be, the new Parthenon was going to be bigger and bolder than its predecessor. It's on the highest point of the Acropolis. Rather than being a standard Doric temple of 13 columns by 6, it was going to be a little bit more. So in lots of senses, the Parthenon was always going to be a little bit more. So instead of 13 by 6, this was going to be 17 by 8, double plus 1 of what it was across one end. Rather than being a single order of architecture, either Doric or Ionic, it was going to be a mixed order. There was some aspects of the building that are Doric and some that are Ionic. There were some clever optical illusions incorporated into the design, not unique to the Parthenon, but there's a thing called entasis, where in order to make lines appear to be straight, things like on columns and on the base, you let them swell a little in the middle, because the effect of the eye's observation of that makes it look like it's straight. Quite clever, and an amazing achievement, given that they didn't have the technology that we do to achieve the same effect today. It's such a big building that the usual 3-step platform for standard temples, those steps were in proportion to the height of the building, but it was so big that some smaller intermediate steps had to be put on those steps, so that the priestly progress into the temple wouldn't have needed ropes or ladders. Inside the temple was the famous cult statue of Athena, described by Pausanias. It doesn't survive till today. It was made out of an ivory core with gold plate or gold leaf on the outside. It was said by one writer that it had 40 talents of gold on it, and it was effectively like a gold store, more or less the Fort Knox of Athens. There was sculpture on the pediments, on the gable ends. There was sculpture on the metopes, the bit between the triglyphs, around the side of the temple, and there was sculpture on the continuous frieze which went around the inner section of the temple, called the naos. Now, this is very unusual to have sculpture in all of those places, and that's part of the nature of it being a mixed Doric-Ionic building. The sculptures are all to do with the triumph of Athens and the supremacy of Greek civilization over non-Greek civilization, or non-Greek barbarism. The most famous of the we could talk for hours about the sculptures on the Parthenon, but just briefly, the most famous bit of sculpture is the continuous frieze, which shows the Panathenaic procession to give a new robe to the statue of Athena every year. And at one end, the presentation of this is happening in the presence of the Olympian gods. It's also true that the number of identifiable figures on this frieze is 192, which is the same number of figures as the Athenian dead at the famous Battle of Marathon in 490, the first time the Athenians repelled the Persian invasion. So it was what we asked at the beginning: what was the purpose of the Parthenon? A major purpose of it had been to be a political statement about Athens and Greece. This is important because now it's controversial, because much of the sculpture for which the Parthenon is so famous is not in Athens. Some of it's in Paris, some of it's in Berlin, but quite a lot of it is in London. Much of this was brought to London, it was brought to Britain and then to specifically to London by Lord Elgin. And he was the British ambassador to Athens in the turn of the 18th to 19th century, when Athens and the rest of Greece was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, basically the Turks. Now, he bought, under somewhat dubious circumstances, sculpture from the Acropolis. Now, the Greeks would say the Turks had no right to sell it. And it's certainly true that Lord Elgin took a great deal more than the legal documentation would seem to allow. For modern Greeks, this is a real insult, and it's an irony and an insult that sculpture which was to proclaim their supremacy and the glory of Athens and the glory of Greece is no longer in Athens, it's no longer in Greece. I wonder what Pericles would have said. Well, he said in his great funeral speech at the end of the first year of the war that Athens was an education to Greece. But surely he would have wanted that to be an education from Greece rather than an education about Greece. I wonder what we should think about this now. Should that sculpture educate the world from London, or should that sculpture educate the world from Athens?